Judith is the award-winning author of two historical novels, The Chanel Sisters and Wycliffe Hall. She grew up in Virginia and earned a BA in Foreign Affairs from UVA. After studying at the Institute of European Studies and the Institut Catholique in Paris, France, and interning at the US Department of State, Judith earned a law degree from UVA's School of Law, where she was on the editorial board of the Journal of International Law and a Dillard Fellow. Judith lives here in Houston with her husband and three children, where she's working on her third novel. When she's not writing or practicing law, Judith enjoys riding horses, reading, scouring the fields during Round Top Antiques Week, and volunteering. Over to you, Judith.
Thank you. Thank you all for having me. I'm very excited to be here, especially after last week and the freezing cold. So I'm glad that we all seem to have survived that. In fact, there's some scenes in the novel where the girls are all huddling around a stove to keep warm. And I thought about how I probably wouldn't have lasted a day back in those days as I was huddling around my gas fireplace trying to get some heat. But anyway, so The Chanel Sisters is my second novel. Both of them were historical fiction. This one is the story, it's the rags to riches story of Coco Chanel as told by her younger sister, Antoinette Chanel. And it ends in 1921, so it does not span the entirety of Coco's very long life, but it's really meant to give a glimpse of her early days before she was famous and before anyone knew who she was and before she was wealthy. I wanted to write this book for probably sounds like a very simple reason, or at least I was attracted to it at first, because I don't have any sisters. And so I have always wondered what it would be like to have a sister. And I've always been certain, that sister that I missed out on would be the perfect older sister who would guide me through life. So when I read that Coco had a sister, Antoinette, I was really curious about what would it have been like to be Coco Chanel's sister. So I started to try to read about it, but there's not a lot known about Antoinette. Most of Coco's biographers have, of course, focused on Coco, and there's a lot to focus on when it comes to Coco, and they never paid a lot of attention to Antoinette. So I had to do some digging myself. These biographers would say that Antoinette was silly. She was pretty and lively, but not as smart as Coco, and not as resilient as Coco. And for some reason, I don't know why, but that just bothered me. It just didn't seem fair, even though I had no idea what the real story was about Antoinette. But I wanted to see where that came from and, kind of what the backup was for that, for the biographers to say that. So as I researched, I found a different Antoinette who was not silly at all, but actually played a major role in the founding of the Chanel Empire as we know it today, but has never been heard of or given credit for it. So one of the things I wanted to do in writing the novel was to bring her story to light and tell, her side of it, and also to show a side of Coco that most people don't know, because Coco Chanel lied about her past to her dying day. She took her background, she had secrets that she took with her to the grave that she didn't want anybody to know. And of course, Antoinette knew those secrets because Antoinette was right there with her. And Antoinette could give a perspective on Coco that nobody else could, being her sister. She knew what it was like. And she also knew the reasons why Coco wanted to keep the past buried and did not want people to know where she came from. So that's why I wrote the story, and that is why I chose Antoinette to be the narrator. She's a more reliable narrator than Coco, who, if it's funny, because you can pick up some biographies from long ago when she was still alive, and she still told her made up stories about her past, and these biographies have that story that she made up, which is not true. So it's kind of interesting how much of a serial liar she was. So I think before I knew a lot about Coco, you might be like me, I assumed that she was born in Paris to a wealthy family, that she was rich and privileged, and that she basically came out of the womb with a strand of pearls around her neck. But the exact opposite is true. She was born in a poor house to an unwed mother. Her father was not there. He was a traveling peddler. He sold items, used clothing or household goods, whatever he could get his hands on, going from market to market. They were vagabonds. They didn't have a home to call their own or a place that they settled in. He was supposedly a big ladies' man, and the parents did marry. Eventually, they were kind of forced to by her mother's family. But the mother spent her time either being pregnant with his children or chasing him down country roads trying to find him. And he just rarely came home. And so the mother spent most of her time doing that, or also working as a laundress or maid to try to put food on the table to take care of the kids. She ended up dying young in her early 30s when Coco was 11 and Antoinette was 7. And so Coco's father came back, and there were 2 boys, 2 younger brothers. He took them to live with a family of farmers as farm labor. And then he took Antoinette and Coco and their older sister and dropped them on the doorstep of a convent orphanage in Aubazine, France, which is a very mountainous, remote region kind of in central France. And there the girls were raised by nuns for almost the next 10 years. And I think, one interesting thing about that is we all know, the name Chanel. Well, that is the only thing that Coco ever got from her father, was his name. And that name, if you think about it, goes back to the man who dropped her off on a convent doorstep, and she never saw him again for the rest of her life. He never came back, and they never saw him. So she went from a very chaotic life to the extreme opposite, very structured life with the nuns who, now they had a roof over their heads, they had food to eat, they had clothing, and every single minute of their day was accounted for. They were taught a skill. The nuns' goal was to give all these girls, the Chanel girls and the other orphans there, some kind of skill so that when they left, they would be able to take care of themselves and they wouldn't end up like Coco's mother did. And they told the girls, when you grow up, you'll be lucky to be a seamstress, or when you grow up, you'll be the wife of a tradesman. At that time, when the status you were born into was the status you would stay into. So if you were born into poverty, that's where you were. It was expected that you would stay there. You wouldn't rise much higher. So there are 3 things I think as I was researching it. The novel starts in the convent. They've been there for about a year. So we experience a little bit of what it was like in the convent. And as the book goes on, I think there's really 3 sort of themes that I realized as I was reading it that kind of define the Coco Chanel that we think of. And one of those is that she had a great, almost a primal need to take care of herself. She could not rely on anybody else. She saw through her mother that relying on someone else could literally kill you. And so when she got let out of the convent, she was ready. She started out as a seamstress because that's the job the nuns found for her, but she didn't plan on doing that long. She wanted to be a star on the stage. She had no intention of sewing. She had no thoughts of being a fashion designer or having anything to do with fashion. She wanted to be up on stage. At the time, for women of her class, there were 2 main ways to become self-sufficient and wealthy, and those were to be a mistress of a wealthy man, and you could collect the jewels that you would get as gifts as kind of a 401k plan for later in life if you were smart about it. And another way was to be on the stage, and so that was what Coco wanted. And so she started singing at a little cafe in Moulins, France on the side, and she had a song that was her specialty, and it was called Coco at the Trocadero, about a little lost dog. And that's how she got her nickname Coco. Her real name is Gabrielle. And when she would go to perform, Mulan had a garrison with soldiers. They would start calling out and shouting, Coco, 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 for her to come onto the stage. And that turned into Coco Chanel. She went from Mulan to Vichy, France, which was a resort town where they had a lot of theaters. And she went there to try her luck in a bigger stage. And she could not get a role. She got turned down for everything she tried, and was very disappointed, didn't know what she was going to do with her life at all. She had nothing, no family, nothing to turn to. And so she ended up moving in as a mistress of a man named Etienne Balsan. And so she lived there at Etienne's chateau in the countryside in France. He was a horse racer. In the meantime, Antoinette, who's a little bit younger, she's still with the nuns, but then she gets out and ends up working at a hat shop in Vichy. Well, she's horrified that Coco is living with a man as a mistress. She's a little more straight-laced than Coco, but Coco goes there, lives the chateau life. And it's interesting because it's there where she really realizes she starts wearing his clothing, because she doesn't have a lot of clothing of her own. And so when she's cold, she'll borrow a sweater from his closet. And then eventually she cuts the sweaters up the middle and puts ribbon on them and buttons and makes cardigans out of them. And it's there that she learns how to ride horses. And she wears men's riding pants, though, to ride horses. And then she even has a tailor in the town make her own riding outfit fashioned after a man's, but to fit her. And of course, this tailor is like, I'm not going to do that, but she insists on him doing it. And so she really learns, that men's clothing is so much more comfortable than women's. And she incorporates that into her own wardrobe, partially because she also didn't have the money to buy the fancy outfits of the day. And I think Etienne was more interested in horses than in having her buy clothes. But she started making hats too. So the hats of the day were these big, you've seen pictures of them, the gigantic, enormous things with flowers and birds and fruit and ribbons and bows. And she couldn't stand those. And so she made these little boaters, just like a simple straw hat. And then she'd tie a ribbon around it. And that was what she would wear. And it was very different from the style of the time. And some of these ladies, the other mistresses who would come to Etienne's house, would ask her where she got them. And then they liked them because I think they made them stand out from the crowd. And so she would start making them for them just to be nice. And eventually she realized that this was something she could do to make money, although she still really wanted to be on the stage. She was reluctant to do it, but she knew she couldn't stay. She didn't want to be a kept woman. So she goes to Paris and starts selling her hats with the help of Antoinette. And one of the things we do know for sure about Antoinette is we have her signature on January 1st, 1910, on the ledger book of the Chanel shop where they sold the hats. And she was Antoinette was the front person who met with the people, and Coco was in the back making the hats because Coco didn't want to, she was embarrassed that she was selling hats. She thought she shouldn't be asking people for money for what she considered a hobby, when her true calling was to be a star of the stage. And she was taking dance lessons. I mean, she tried her entire life she took singing lessons until when she was in her 80s. But so that's how the hat business started. It was really her great desire to take care of herself. And when she opened a hat store with Antoinette on the Rue Cambon in Paris, which is where, her store still is, only it's much more expanded. She had another lover at the time whose name was Boy Capel, and he helped her finance that shop and get her start. And one day, I think the store had been in existence for about, I can't remember, like about a year. And they're walking down the street together to go to dinner. And she tells him that she cannot believe how easy it is to make money. And she's like, wow, this is just so easy. I mean, I'm just making so much money. I can't believe it. And he said, well, what do you mean? And she said, well, every time I ask the bank for money, they give me money. And he laughed at her and he said, that's because I have given them a line of credit. I'm guaranteeing you, that's my money. And she was so horrified. I mean, this was like a huge turning point in her life. She threw her purse at him, she ran away, and she just had no idea that she really thought she was doing it on her own. But from that moment, she took over the business. She stopped, not paying attention to details. She started to really make sure that she knew how much money was coming in and how much was going out. And she really became a businesswoman at that point, along with Antoinette's help. And eventually they opened a second boutique in DeVille with Boy's financial backing. And then they opened a third one in Biarritz, which Antoinette went and ran that one. And so with the Biarritz store, this was during World War I. The store was extremely successful because it was close to Spain. Spain wasn't in the war. And so they were still buying fancy clothes there. It was the first place where Coco sold couture. And with the money they made from that, she was able to pay back Boy Capel everything she owed him. And she was never dependent on anyone else again. And in fact, it's interesting because later in life, and this is outside the scope of the book because it's after 1921, but she was the girlfriend of the Duke of Westminster, who at the time was the wealthiest man in England. And so there were always a lot of rumors about whether or not they were going to get married. And one time someone asked her about it and she said, well, anyone can be the Duchess of Westminster, but there can only be one Coco Chanel. And they never married, but she lived his lifestyle, but she always worked. She would go to stay at his country house in England, and then she'd go back, fly back to Paris, or not fly, I guess, however they got back. But so she was a working woman whose lover was the richest man in England. And she did say, she went through a lot of hard times in her life personally, and she did say that work was the one thing that was always there for her. She could always go back and work. And so that helped her get through a lot of the problems of her life. And so that one, that great need for financial independence was huge. Another thing that is really interesting about her that I think is part of one of the themes in the book is that she had a great need also for freedom. If you imagine being locked behind the walls of a convent for all those years, probably anybody would have a great desire for freedom. But it was also in other ways too, I think, from poverty. She had a great desire to be free from poverty, from the rules of society, from the rules of society that were upon women. And this desire for freedom that she had translated itself into her clothing and the clothing that she wore. She wanted to be able to move. And so again, it's the men's clothes that she started out with. And then similar to the hats, she would make her own clothing. And people would start asking her where she got it. She'd start making these long sweaters for friends. But a lot of that came from DeVille, which was a resort town. And she spent a lot of time there with Boy Capel. And it was where she started doing things like playing tennis and playing golf and swimming, which a lot of women didn't do. But, she wanted to live. She wanted to do all these things, and she needed the clothes to be able to move around and do them. And so she made them for herself, and she made them for Antoinette. And they would walk along the boardwalk and show them off. And people would come to their store and ask about them. And so she really started off selling sports clothes. And then when World War I came around, the role of women totally changed. And women had to, up until then, women had been more decorative than functional. And with World War I, women had to be more functional because the men were off fighting the wars. And for instance, in DeVille, there was a group of society women who wanted to volunteer as nurses at a hospital. And they went to the hospital and the doctors told them, you cannot work here in those clothes. Those are ridiculous. You can't wear that here. It'll get in the way. It's a hazard. And so the doctor pulled out of some cabinet a bunch of old nurses' uniforms and said, you have to wear these. And, they were horrified, of course. They couldn't wear those. So they took them to Coco who wasn't famous yet, but in DeVille, you know, she was starting to make a name for herself. And they said, what can you do with these? Can you turn them into something that, you know, we can wear? And so she did. She fixed them up. She probably, I'm sure, made them so they fit better. She was always big on, you know, things had to fit properly. And she spiffed them up a bit. So then these ladies started wearing these the volunteer outfits made by Coco. And so she really, in many ways during the war, she changed the way that women were able to interact with the world from how they had been. Like, for instance, one of the, you may have heard of him, but Paul Poiret was one of the famous designers of the time, a man, and she could not stand him. She hated his style. He was very theatrical. A lot of it was kind of costumey in her opinion. She thought it was too costumey. He made harem pants popular. And another thing that was popular at the time, believe it or not, was the hobble skirt. You know, so women were actually going around in a hobble skirt. And of course, Coco hated that. And later on, they had a rivalry. And later, after Coco invented the little black dress that we all know about, she was wearing black, and which was not a common thing then. And Paul Poiret said to her, Madame, for whom are you in mourning? You know, it's kind of a dig. And she said, for you, monsieur, because she was digging back because he was out and she was in. He was, in her mind, a relic of the past. So her philosophy was quite opposite from his. Hers was a woman should dress to live. She should not live to dress. And that was what Coco really wanted to do, was to live and not have to think about, what am I going to wear today? How is my clothing going to inhibit my ability to move around and do what I want to do? And then there is the third huge major influence on her life, of course, was the convent in other ways. She lied about her past. She never told anybody that she was raised in a convent orphanage. That was the big secret. She did tell people that she was raised in the countryside by old maid aunts. So she didn't make up a story, you know, that was glitzy. She still made up sort of a modest story, but she didn't want to admit the nuns. But she left all these clues in plain sight about exactly where she came from, because she had that great fondness for black and white, and that was the nuns' uniforms were black and white. And in fact, I was looking at a Chanel bag today, like just the bag that you know, they put stuff you buy in, and they're still black and white. So she really favored black and white. She introduced these kind of the nubby, woolly fabrics that were not a thing at the time at all. They were more of a peasant-y type fabric, like the uniform that the girls would wear at the orphanage. Everything she had was very simple, clean lined and elegant, modest. If you think about it, her clothing was never really skimpy. She hated the mini skirt. She detested the mini skirt. Of course, that came later too. She made her chain link belts that we all are probably familiar with, are exactly like the rosary belts the nuns wore around their waists. They wore rosaries, and then the rosary would dangle down, just like Coco's belts. She mimicked, there are some mosaics in the walkways at the convent, and with stars and celestial patterns in them, and she mimicked those in her jewelry. During World War I, fabric was hard to come by, and she found a big stash of jersey. And up until that time, jersey was only used for men's underclothes. So she bought up all this jersey and turned it into dresses and outfits for women, and had the creme de la creme of society wearing men's underwear as a fabric and paying exorbitant prices for it. And she did the same with fur during World War I. The expensive furs were really hard to come by. So she went out to the country and kept all the peasants in business by having them trap fur or trap rabbits. And she had all of society wearing rabbit fur. So I don't know if she did this as an inside joke on purpose or what, but it was, she really, again, like I said, there were a lot of clues in plain sight to where she came from and her past. In fact, in later life, she built a home in the south of France for herself that mimicked, she had the stairway replicated from the convent in Aubazine. She had an architect make the same exact stairway, and there were certain other areas of the home that mimicked parts of the convent orphanage. And then there she did a very plain and simple decor style with a buffet style eating. And in fact, I don't know if you've been to Dallas, but the museum there has a replica of this home there called La Posa in one of its rooms. It's got the staircase too, a replica there of this home in the south of France. And then I think also one really interesting thing about how the convent affected her life. I mean, in fact, if there was no convent orphanage, I don't think we would even know about Coco Chanel. I think she probably would have ended up like her mother. But for her and Antoinette, when they lived there, they were living in the middle of a female-owned and run business. And so they spent all those years watching women run the convent orphanage themselves. And they monogrammed and embroidered sheets and linens for people in the village, so they made money that way. But they had been exposed to that, where women are doing all this by themselves. There's the Mother Abbess, who is almost like a CEO. And so I think in a way they learned that, how to run a business in a way by living under the watch of those women and their own organizational structure there. And then probably the biggest clue of her background and where she came from is the Chanel logo itself, which is the interlocking C's. That, I think when most people see that, they think luxury and Chanel and expense and elegance and Paris. Well, if the convent orphanage in Aubazine has stained or leaded glass windows that are a series of overlapping circles. And within those overlapping circles are the overlapping C's of the Chanel logo. And so her biographers go back and trace that to one of the sources for the Chanel logo. And people have asked me what is something that I hope people take away from the book of the Chanel sisters. And I hope that when people see that logo of the interlocking C's, that they don't just see luxury and elegance in Paris, that they see these two girls who came from nothing, the two sisters who were abandoned at a convent orphanage and somehow managed to pull themselves up out of poverty and be the people that they wanted to be and not the people society told them they were supposed to be, and become the founders of the Chanel brand that we know today. So that is, those themes are all explored in the book. I mean, that, but only there, I don't, they're shown instead of told, as I'm telling you now. But that's really one reason why I wanted to write the book, because I just thought her past was so interesting on how all these different factors went into making this brand that still survives today, which I think is pretty amazing that it's still so popular and sought after when all of the other people she was competing with back then, we've never heard. I mean, they bit the dust. They're not around anymore. And then also to tell Antoinette's forgotten story. So I would love to answer questions. So any questions, because I don't know, I love to know what you guys really want to talk about. And so Electra, should I?
Well, let's start with the ones. Karin, do you want to ask your question first? Are you muted, Karin?
I'm unmuted now.
Okay.
I do some writing, as do a number of us here, and I believe in the muse. I think that I'm direct once I get to writing, I'm led in by, well, my question is, do you believe in the muse?
Well, what do you mean? What does the muse mean to you?
It's an inspiration to take my story someplace that perhaps I hadn't thought about, but it fits right in and it makes it a better, stronger story.
I do. I mean, I do feel that, well, first of all, you have to start writing for the muse to appear.
Right.
The muse doesn't usually show up when you're just sitting there, although sometimes. But yeah, I mean, I do have, it sounds weird, but I do feel like I have heard little voices in my, not voices, but something will pop in and it'll say, no, you need to go this way. And I didn't think of it. Like, it just came, like, wasn't me. And then I don't know if you've experienced this or anybody else, but I mean, I've had characters who demanded more time on the page. Like if you read the book, there's a character who is at the country house. He's one of the men, and he invents this dance called the kite dance. I don't know where he came from or why he's even in the story, but he just demanded this part in the book. And then there's another character, Arturo, who really pretty much just wrote himself. But so I don't know, sometimes I wonder, are they like someone talking to us from somewhere else and saying, I'll read this book? No.
It's also kind of fun to think that you and the muse are working together.
Well, I do wonder because Coco, she didn't want anybody. I was worried that she might try to stop the book from getting published. She didn't want anybody to write about her at all. She wanted to do her own story. And so one of the best biographies of her is by a woman, Edmond SRUW, and they were friends. And then when Coco found out she was writing a biography of her, Coco would not speak to her again and told everybody she knew not to speak to her. And the same thing happened with Coco had a really close friend who was famous herself. And so she was writing her memoirs and Coco said, well, you better not write about me. And so this woman had written a whole chapter about her and had to take the chapter out. I mean, they were best friends for 30 years and there's no mention in her memoir of Coco Chanel at all because Coco made her take it out. So her idea was to control her own narrative. And she started telling her memoirs to a friend later in life, which was the made up story, no part about the convent orphanage at all, to try to control that. So
can I ask a piggyback question on, so is the Chanel brand still owned somehow in her family, like with the nephew, or is it publicly owned, or do you know?
I don't believe it's owned in her family. It's I think it's corporate owned. There's a family called who had owned most of Chanel No. 5. She owned a small part of Chanel No. 5. And I think somehow that family still owns part of the whole Chanel.
And they don't try to control, no one's trying to control the story anymore, right? I mean, I assume, she's passed away. So, right?
Right. And as Antoinette, part of my research, Antoinette has some family, which I can't say too much because it gives the story away, but she has family that has done some genealogical research on her. And so I reached out to them and got some really great information about parts of Antoinette's life. And they sent me pictures and different things that really helped with the story. And the main man, because I was really nervous about writing about one of their, because there's another family member involved, but I was really nervous about writing about their family member and, fictionalizing this person's life and what are they going to think. But so the man, they're Canadian, and he CC'd me on an email to all their 25 family members, that recommending my book. So I was like, okay, phew.
Julie, do you want to ask your question? Oh, you're muted.
I want to just apologize to everyone. I should have said before we started the program that if you have a question, please put it in the chat line, and then we know that you're wanting to ask the question, and Lepta will recognize you to ask your question. So that's point number one. Point number two, on the muse, Karen's point, just a really brief sideline. I think the muse comes to me in writing, but not only that, sometimes places have a very strong character. And just one little anecdote, when my very first post in the Foreign Service was Tel Aviv, and I was organizing a party for the ambassador. And I based it, of course, because I'm in Louisiana. We had a Mardi Gras party, and I had to name my crew something. And I, of course, with my bias, would think I would pick Diana or Hera, or, a female goddess. But I said, no, I'm going to call it the Crew of Apollo. And we did, and we had the Mardi Gras party, and it was all great fun. And later, I found out that that little town outside of Tel Aviv, where we lived, had been called Apollonarium under the Romans. So that muse, which I had never read this anywhere, I promise you, it was not deep in my subconscious. It just came to me. And it was the right name for that event at the ambassador's residence in Herzliya, Batua, in Israel. Anyway, but my question, I know you've talked and your book is all really about Coco. That's what people are going to be interested in. But I was very interested in Antoinette as your character and how she helps her sister. Really, she's fundamental to her sister being a success. And yet, as you said, we know nothing about her. And so to develop her story, as you say in your historical note, you had to invent this fictitious character, Lucho Harrington. And that gives a reason for her to flee to Argentina after she leaves her husband. But do you have any insight into what really made her go from Canada to Argentina instead of back to France? I mean, I would think she would just return to France. Why did she go to Argentina?
I thought about that a lot, and it's very mysterious. In fact, Oscar's family, we talked about it, and I've tried to figure it out why she went to Buenos Aires. She was in her 30s. We don't know much about her love life before Canada, but I know she must have had one. There's no way a woman like her did not have some kind of love life. And Coco was, hung around with the polo playing crowd and an international crowd, and there were a lot of South Americans. So just extrapolating on that and the fact that she was in Buenos Aires, it seemed to me that it might have been a love interest that drew her there, because she really had no other connection to and why would she not go back to France? And so Oscar has a daughter in real life, and from a second marriage. And so I had talked to her, and she said that, because I was worried too about how she would feel about the book. And so she said that she was glad that she went to Buenos Aires because it made it a happier ending for Antoinette than the mystery of why she went to Buenos Aires at all. But there had to have been someone there, I think. Well, and I will say, okay, speaking of the muse, I did have a weird thing happen. I'll say too much if I say it, but it had to do with opening up a dictionary, a Spanish-English dictionary, to the exact page randomly that had some kind of word on it that meant something. That's all I can say. It seemed like a sign of Buenos Aires a little bit more. But yeah, I wish I knew. They say if you could talk to someone from heaven or wherever, who would it be? And I'd be like, I need to talk to her to find out exactly what really happened.
Let's see. Julia, did you have any more to your question, or do you want to? Okay. Oops. No, okay. So I have lots of questions, but anybody who has one, just go ahead and stop me. But do you know the order that the convent was that they were raised in?
You know, I don't. I could find out, but I don't know.
Just random curiosity about that.
I don't know, but I will tell you the Aubazine Abbey is on Instagram.
Oh,
We are on Instagram. It's not an orphanage anymore. It's a beautiful old medieval building, and they have a cat that is called Shaw Chanel, and Instagram account follows the adventures of this little cat. But it's kind of fun to follow because it's just very picturesque.
cool. I have to look that up. Okay. So about the writing process and like, for example, Roald Dahl, I know he had his little like kind of hut outside his house that he would write for several hours every morning. Do you have a time and ritual about your writing?
No, I don't. I wish I did. I'm very random. I work, and I started writing when my kids were little. It was kind of my escape from toddlers, and I felt like I could escape into this world where the characters had to do what I told them to do, and were more logical than the little people that I was living with. And my kids are older now, but it's still kind of an escape for me. You know, if I've had a stressful day or whatever, I'm like, you know what, I am just going to go into my own world and forget about this one for a little while. So I've always just really written whenever I have a chance to. Most of the time that's at night. Not a morning person, but I wish I had a she shed or something that I could go write in, but I don't.
And a question about your writing group. So we know about you, or I know about you because Ann Weisgarber told us I have a friend in my writing group. And how does that fit into your work?
Well, that's huge. If I didn't have my writing group, I never would have gotten published, period. I found my writing group through Imprint. If you all are familiar with Imprint, I took one of their classes on the novel. And for my first book, which is World War II historical fiction, I was working on that barely. And I brought what I thought were just the most genius opening pages ever. And they had the word flotsam in them. I mean, how awful is that? And, read them, and those of course, that word came out, and those pages ended up being like almost at the ending of the novel when it finally got published. But through that, a group of us still wanted to stay together, including Ann Weisgarber, to meet and critique each other's work. And so we've been meeting once a week since then. That was a long time ago because I was pregnant with my youngest, and she's now 16. And so we do it through Zoom now. We used to meet in person, but now we meet by Zoom. And it's been, they've been there to really, I don't know about the rest of y'all, but it's hard to write alone. And you think you're conveying something, but you're not. And, they'll tell me we used to have one member, she's not in it anymore, but she would write on the side of your paper. You wouldn't see it till you went home with the pages, and then you look over comments, and she would write on the side, boring, boring, boring in really big letters. And it was kind of hard. Like at first I'd be offended, and then I'd think, she's actually right. This part is really boring. And so I would get over it, but it's, I couldn't do it without their guidance and moral support and insights. And so, yeah, I highly recommend having a critique group.
And do you write longhand or on your laptop?
I mainly write on my laptop, but if I get totally stuck, I do write in longhand just to try to get something out. Because I don't know, I can just, like, something about the computer screen can just make you freeze, I feel like you can just sit there and stare at it for a really long time without writing anything.
And I'm sure the research is a big, like the hat making, the horses, the places have to be really accurate. That had to take a long time, a lot of effort.
It did take a long time. And so I'm evolving as a researcher. With my first book and with this book, I had the philosophy that I wanted to research as I was writing, because I wanted to live in the moment research-wise while I was writing it. And then when I was working with my editor on the Chanel sisters, and she kept asking me questions, and I could never find anything. And, you know, what about like we went on the timeline a million times trying to make sure the timeline was correct. Because part of it was difficult because Chanel did lie about her past. So there's certain dates that are, you know, are approximate. And, but anyway, so it was really, I spent so much time trying to find things. And I had read that Philippa Gregory, the author, she said that she basically gets a BA in whatever she's writing about, like the next topic. And so she'll spend like a year or more researching, reading all the books. And so that is what I have done for the book I'm working on now. And I think it's like genius. That's not genius, but I have like this huge, it's like a 50-page timeline. And then I have hyperlinks. So I can find things on the internet. If this ever crashes, I'm in huge trouble, but I have like hyperlinks to go find articles I found. And it actually is a much better process to have done it that way. I mean, of course, Philippa Gregory, like why I would think she would not know better than me, I don't know. But so, yeah, so I'm trying to, I definitely recommend doing your research first.
Julie has a question.
Sorry, I have like Electra, I have a lot of questions. Back to your writing group, you mentioned that you used to meet weekly. Do you still meet weekly? And from what you also said, now I understand that you gave each other hard copies of your manuscript, and then after your critique group, they would return the pages to you with comments. Zoom has changed everything for everyone. So are you still sharing your pages ahead of time, or do you read your thing when the group meets? Do you read it to each other? And do you use any of the modern apps to put the comments in? You know, we, SRUW, have been struggling with Google Docs, I'll tell you that. So,
oh, I cannot figure out Google Docs to save my life. People send me things in Google Docs all the time, and I'm like, I can't conceptually understand how there can be this document and we can all work on it at the same time. I don't know. I don't understand it, but no, I mean, Zooming is about as high tech as we've gotten. When we met in person, after, you know, evolving a little bit in the beginning when we first started meeting, what we do now is we each bring 6 pages. And so back when we met in person, we would print out 6 pages for everybody. And there's only like 4 or 5 of us, or sometimes 6 if everybody shows up. So we print out 6 pages at the most. I mean, people are welcome to bring 1 page or 2. And then we would hand them out, and then we have to read, which I hate, but you have to read your pages to everybody. And then the critique begins. And so now with Zoom, we email our pages to each other the night before, and then we print them out ourselves. And then as the person's reading, we write down our comments, but we have not figured out a good way to share, other than verbally, to share our comments with each other, except to just say what they are. But it's funny because when we first started meeting, one thing that we did in the in-print class was, you know, you always start your critique with something complimentary. That has totally gone out the window. Like, we don't do that anymore. I mean, if we have complimentary things to say, we say it, but we don't do kind of the, oh, well, I think, you know, this was really good. We've been doing it with each other long enough that we don't really need to do that anymore. But so, yeah, I mean, that's the 6-page thing has worked. I mean, we meet for 3 hours. It's a long 3 hours and we use every second. We set a timer. So it's timed. Everybody usually gets like 35 to 40 minutes for their individual critique. We have an order that changes. So that's how we do it. It hasn't gotten any easier to read the pages out loud. All these years, it's still kind of painful, but that's how we've managed it.
and is it the same 4 or 5 or 6 people that you started with, or have you rotated people in and out?
There's 3 of us who were there from the beginning, and then pretty much the whole class started at first, and then people really started dropping like flies after a while. But me and Anne are 2 of the originals, and then there's another one who's been there the whole time. And then we have 3 who have been added over time, just from different ways that we knew them and they're right and thought they would fit in with the group, and they have. We've had people we've had to kick out. We make Anne do that. Anne has to kick people out all the time. Like, it's hilarious. I mean, and I don't like, we had a man once who nothing is, we'd love to have more men, but this particular man was writing a memoir, and it was kind of like all about himself and wanting to be complimented. And so that just didn't work out. So Anne had to be the bearer of bad news. But she does it in a very lovely way.
Would you also just talk briefly about how you found your agent? I'm assuming you had one, and your publisher. Is your publisher's Canadian? How did you link up with them? And are they part of a conglomerate or a mid-sized press or what?
No, my publisher's not Canadian. They're Graydon House is an imprint of HarperCollins, but my book was published by HarperCollins Canada too. So there's some events that I've done with HarperCollins Canada, but the Graydon House, you know, all these, the big five publishers have like a gazillion imprints. It's so hard to keep track of. And, but each imprint is supposed to address a different area of fiction or nonfiction. And so Graydon House is the imprint that bought the Chanel sisters, but then ultimately, like, my publicist works for HarperCollins. And so that's for the Chanel sisters. For my first book, that Wycliffe Hall was published by an extremely small publisher. So that was a whole different experience from the Chanel sisters. And then finding my agent took me forever, like a really long time, and many rejections because if anybody doesn't know, you have to have an agent to submit your manuscript to most publishers. Now, some of the smaller presses, you don't have to have an agent, but the big ones, you have to have an agent to kind of vet you. And so getting an agent is really hard. And the process of getting an agent for my first book, and she's still my agent, was really how I learned how to tell a story, to be honest. I had always been good at writing, but I didn't realize I didn't know how to tell a story when I first started out. And the rejection process was kind of what taught me how to tell a story, because these agents would read, you know, you submit your a letter to them, a query letter, and then based on that, they say, okay, they either totally ignore you, send you a form rejection letter, or say, I'd like to read the first 50 pages, or I'd like to read the whole thing. Then you send it to them. And then again, you either never hear from them again, or they send you a rejection, which in my case, the rejections they sent always gave me advice. So they would always give me enough advice that kind of kept me going. In fact, I had the agent for The Help who read it, and she told me, this is my first novel, it had been written in first person. And she said, I don't know why you didn't write this in third person. And so I thought, I don't know why either, but you're the agent for The Help, so I'm going to go back and put the whole thing in third person. So I did. And I just kept getting, you know, different advice from these agents. And a lot of times I would query them again and say, oh, hey, remember me? I rewrote this. Would you be interested in taking a look again? And a lot of times they said yes, and then they would reject it again. But eventually I got to my agent and went through a long process with her where one of her junior agents read it and then sent it back to me and gave me like pages of editorial comments. And they don't make any money, you know, from this. And she said, if you're willing to make these changes, then send it back to us. And so I thought they were all good. You know, I agreed with them. So I made the changes. 6 months later, sent it back. Then wait a while again, then another agent at the same agency read it, and she gives me more comments. And same thing, you know, if you're willing to make these, send it back. So I went through like 3 rounds of that until finally it went to Kimberly, who's my agent and who runs the agency. And that was when they sent me a contract. But a lot of it is, you know, that you know this, they want to see that you're not a diva, that you're willing, you know, to listen and to make changes. In fact, I was listening to a podcast today where there was an author who told me she spent 3.5 years revising her novel with her agent before her agent even sent it out to publishing houses. And it's the book Woman on the Edge. It's a thriller. I don't know I haven't read it, but I've heard of it. But she spent 3.5 years revising that with her agent before they sent it out. And then she said she spent like a year and a half revising it with her editor before it got published, which is insane.
One last quick question. We're almost to the end of the hour, but can you tell us how much marketing you have to do as the author of the book?
You have to do a lot of marketing. With the small publisher, I pretty much set everything up. I hired a publicist myself. With Graydon House, they have a publicist who sets everything up for me. But I also, you have to be willing to go out there and put yourself out there, and which I think is not natural to a lot of writers, but you definitely have to do that. The days of, being a reclusive author, I think are, well, you can if you're certain people like Delia Owens, maybe.
Yeah, we had a previous author who's a Rice graduate, and he talked with us, and he said he'd made major mistakes with his first novel by refusing to give interviews and by not wanting to get out there. I think he thought he was going to be the new whatever reclusive author in the woods or something. But he recognized he made a mistake, and he said, I won't make that mistake again. So, and that's what everyone says. A lot of people are going to indie publishing because they're doing so much of the work themselves anyway. Why not do it all themselves?
Yeah. I mean, it has its definite benefits to do that.
Julie Gregory has a question. If you can unmute, if you have it.
Sorry. And I was just thinking as you were saying that, I finished the book in pretty quickly, and it normally takes me a long time to read books, but how can we help you, like in terms of promoting it or getting the word out there to people that we enjoyed the book and it's worth the purchase?
Well, thank you for asking that. It always, tell your friends. I think word of mouth is a big way. Writing an Amazon review is helpful because I think they have certain algorithms, and if you get like to certain points on the amount of reviews you have, you can even, like, they have a new thing on Amazon, which I kind of like. You don't even have to write a review. You can just rate it and just press buttons, so you don't have to spend all that time figuring out what you want to say. Social media, if you have any social media, that's always helpful too, to say something about the book. But I read something recently. Someone did a study and they said that word of mouth was really the biggest way that a book gets known.
Is Goodreads a good way? Like, Goodreads, the site?
Yeah, I think Goodreads is. I had to remove myself from Goodreads because I had to stop reading the reviews because I was making myself insane. Like there's some people who, the book ends in 1921, and I would have some people say that I glossed over, Coco was involved with the Nazis in World War II, which is, my book doesn't address that because that was in 1940s and the book ends in 1921. And then I would have people write reviews saying that it wasn't historically accurate because I didn't talk about, I'm like, it's two different wars. And so I just was like, I've removed myself from Goodreads, but a lot of people, readers love Goodreads. There's a lot of people on it. Someday I'll probably go back, but it's just like as an author, it's not a healthy place to read. There's lots of good reviews, but there can be one review that
And Amazon, you're saying, to Julie's question, the most reach is from Amazon, I guess, not Goodreads.
Well, Amazon owns Goodreads. It's interesting. I have a ton more reviews on Goodreads than I have on Amazon. I don't know why they don't just put them on both. I don't really understand it. I mean, and Goodreads is weird. I know we're like over time. Before the book was even published, I got a couple of 1-star ratings, like from someone in Jamaica and someone in Ireland, and the book wasn't even published yet. And so I was like, what is this? And usually people, I know this from experience, who give you a 1-star rating, they're mad about something. And they don't just give you 1 star, they write about what they're so mad about. that they didn't like. And so it was just odd. It's just an odd,
Mhm.
it's not good to read. I think authors shouldn't really not read reviews, period. But to have reviews helps with the algorithms.
Yes, thank you so much. You're right. We have come to the end of our hour. And first of all, big thanks to Judith for sharing this hour with us. We really appreciate it. We're trying as a group to promote Houston writers and Rice writers. And so we always ask our writers if you have any suggestions for someone else we should invite. Whether they live in Houston or not is not important anymore because we are Zooming these events. But we do appreciate, and you could talk it over with Electra if you have some suggestions.
I do, yeah, I definitely can give you some suggestions.
We really appreciate that. I'd like to thank, as always, Carrie Pius, who makes these events possible from the Rice Alumni Office. I would like to just say, in case anybody joined us late, we are having our postponed meeting on March 22nd, Monday, March 22nd at noontime. It'll be our last program for this academic year. And the topic is going to be the U.S. Foreign Service. And let me see what else. And most of all, thanks to all of you who are either SRUW members or Rice alumni or people who've heard about this. We really appreciate your joining in with us and making these events, we think, very successful. And
Can I ask one question, Julie, please?
Yeah.
Is this going to be a movie?
Oh, I wish, I hope.
It would be the best movie.
If everybody can just put that out into the universe, make this a movie, that would be great.
Okay, I will.
we always think we had a, I can't help but say this, I keep bringing this up. We had a Rice professor speak to us, not in the evening, but in the daytime. He wrote a historical book about an enslaved woman. And we had a small audience. I'm being generous when I say a small audience. Well, he subsequently won the Pulitzer Prize for his book. And so we feel that we're pathfinders for other people who come along later. And so we hope for the best for you, Judith. If you want your book to be made into a movie, we hope that happens.
Yes, thank you. Well, I hope you are the pathfinders. And if you are, I will totally give you credit. I'll say it was all because of the Rice group. That is why we are at the Oscars today.
You can say we're the muse for the Houston writing community.
That's right.
Thank you so much, Judith. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you. Appreciate it.